600 hours. March 23, 1943. Major General Terry Allen stood in a forward command post 3 miles west of Elgeta, Tunisia. Through his field glasses, he watched 50 German tanks emerge from a mountain pass. The morning air was cool. The sky, perfectly clear. Visibility, perfect. Allen could see every detail of the German column as it descended from the hills into the valley below. Panzers in formation, moving with the confidence of veterans who had crushed enemies across 3 continents. 27 days earlier, these same Germans had routed American forces at Kasserine Pass. 6,500 men lost. A 50-mile retreat in just 5 days. The defeat was total, humiliating, and very, very public. The Germans called American soldiers cowards. The British questioned whether Americans could fight at all. American newspapers back home reported the disaster in stark terms that made it impossible to ignore. The credibility of the entire American war effort was at stake. Now, less than a month later, those same Americans were dug in across the Elgeta Valley with orders to stop the German 10th Panzer Division. Allen had commanded the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, for 9 months. He knew his men. He knew their strengths and their weaknesses. He knew they were green, untested, unproven, but he also knew they were Americans. And Americans did not quit. The question was whether anyone else would ever find that out. What happened in those 27 days between Kasserine Pass and Elgeta represents the fastest large-scale military transformation in modern warfare history. How the United States Army went from humiliating defeat to crushing victory in less than 4 weeks. How American forces learned to adapt faster than the British, faster than the Soviets, faster than the Germans themselves, and why that ability to adapt would ultimately change the course of World War II. This is that story. The German attack came exactly as intelligence predicted. Panzerkampfwagen Mark for tanks, Marder tank destroyers, armored half-tracks carrying infantry. The kind of coordinated mechanized assault that had crushed Poland in 3 weeks and France in 6 weeks. The kind of assault that had driven American forces back 50 miles at Kasserine Pass just under 1 month ago. The Germans were confident. They had beaten Americans before. They expected to beat them again. What the Germans didn't know was that the American army they faced at Elgeta was not the same army they had defeated at Kasserine Pass. In 27 days, the United States Army had transformed itself more completely than any Allied force had managed in 3 years of war. Before we go any further, do me a favor. Take 2 seconds and hit that subscribe button. We're diving deep into forgotten stories of military history, the kind of transformations and battles that changed everything, but somehow got buried in the history books. And drop a comment right now telling me where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany. Let me know. Our community stretches across the entire world, and I love seeing where everyone's tuning in from. All right. Let's get into how this transformation happened. The story begins in the Atlas Mountains of Tunisia on February 14, 1943. That morning, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, launched an offensive against American positions at Kasserine Pass, a 2-mile-wide gap in the Grand Dorsal mountain chain. The pass was strategically critical. Control of Kasserine meant control of the routes through the mountains. The Americans defending the pass were inexperienced. Most had never fired a shot in combat. They had arrived in North Africa just weeks earlier as part of Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa. Their commander, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, had positioned his forces poorly. He split units into small, isolated groups without mutual support. The military term for this was penny packets, small detachments assigned individual tasks without coordination. It was a recipe for disaster. The American tanks, M3 Lees and M3 Grants, had high silhouettes that made them easy targets. These medium tanks mounted both a 75mm gun in a side sponson and a 37mm gun in a turret. The design was a compromise born of urgency, not optimal engineering. The tank commanders had no experience fighting German armor. They had trained against other American tanks in Louisiana and the Mojave Desert. German tanks were faster, better armored, and crewed by veterans who had fought across Poland, France, and Russia. The infantry had dug shallow scrapes instead of proper foxholes. They didn't understand that German tanks would deliberately drive over shallow positions and rotate their tracks to crush anyone hiding there. These were lessons that would be learned in blood. When Rommel attacked, the American lines collapsed within hours. German panzers broke through the pass. Italian forces supporting the attack overran American artillery positions. Fredendall's scattered units couldn't coordinate a defense. They couldn't call for artillery support because batteries only responded to their dedicated observers, and those observers were spread across different frequencies. Air support was non-existent. The different American units didn't even know where each other were positioned. Some units retreated into positions already occupied by the Germans. By the night of February 16, 1943, the Second Corps had lost 1,600 men, nearly 100 tanks, 57 half-tracks, and 29 artillery pieces. The retreat continued for 5 more days. Rommel pushed American forces back 50 miles. He captured the towns of Sidi Bouzid, Spatla, and Feriana. American soldiers abandoned equipment, supplies, and positions. British forces fighting alongside the Americans also retreated, losing all 11 of their tanks. By February 22nd, when the German advance finally stopped, American casualties totaled 6,500 men, 300 killed, 3,000 wounded, 3,000 missing. The Americans had lost 183 tanks, more than 500 trucks and motor vehicles, 100 for half-tracks, and 208 artillery pieces. German losses: 989 casualties and 30 for tanks. The United States Army had suffered its worst defeat of World War II. The British questioned American competence. German officers openly mocked American fighting ability. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander in the Mediterranean, told Hitler that American soldiers were poorly trained and poorly led. The defeat at Kasserine Pass created a crisis for the American war effort. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied commander in North Africa, faced a fundamental question. Could American forces fight the Germans on equal terms, or would the United States need to rely on British forces to carry the ground war in Europe? The answer to that question would determine Allied strategy for the entire war. If Americans couldn't defeat German forces in North Africa, how could they be trusted to lead the invasion of France? Winston Churchill was already skeptical about American military capability. After Kasserine Pass, his doubts seemed justified. British commanders Montgomery and Alexander concluded that Americans were hopelessly trained, poorly led, made poor soldiers, and were unlikely to improve quickly. But Eisenhower saw something in the Kasserine defeat that others missed. American units had fought poorly, but they hadn't broken completely. Some units had held their ground under impossible odds. American artillery, when it finally got organized, had stopped German advances with devastating firepower. The problem wasn't American soldiers. The problem was American leadership, American doctrine, and American coordination. Those were problems that could be fixed on February 26, 1943. Just 2 days after Rommel withdrew from Kasserine Pass, Eisenhower began the most rapid military transformation in modern warfare. Eisenhower's first move was brutal. He relieved Major General Lloyd Fredendall of command on March 6, 1943. Fredendall had positioned his headquarters 70 miles behind the front lines, dug into a canyon where he felt safe from air attack. Engineers had blasted tunnels into rock for underground bunkers. Eisenhower later called it the only time during the war that he ever saw a higher headquarters so concerned over its own safety. Omar Bradley termed it an embarrassment to every American soldier. Fredendall had never personally reconnoitered the battlefield. He didn't know the terrain. He had split his divisions into small combat commands scattered across 50 miles of desert. When the Germans attacked, Fredendall couldn't coordinate a response because his units were too dispersed. Eisenhower replaced Fredendall with Major General George Patton, a 57-year-old cavalry officer who had spent his entire career preparing for mechanized warfare. Patton took command at 1000 hours on March 6, 1943. He had 17 days to transform the Second Corps before Eisenhower ordered them back into battle. Patton understood something fundamental about military organizations. They will die for a commander they fear and respect. Patton needed both. He started with discipline. Every soldier in the Second Corps was ordered to wear a complete, clean, pressed uniform at all times. Soldiers who failed to wear leggings, helmets, or proper insignia faced court-martial. Officers who allowed their men to appear slovenly were relieved of command. Patton personally drove through American positions looking for violations. He stopped jeeps, inspected uniforms, questioned soldiers about their weapons and equipment. He fined officers $50 for not wearing neckties. He made enlisted men dig new foxholes because the old ones were too shallow. He was everywhere, all the time, demanding perfection. The Second Corps hated him. Soldiers called him a tyrant. Officers complained that he cared more about appearances than combat. Some wondered if Patton understood that they were preparing for battle, not a parade. But Patton understood something the soldiers didn't yet grasp. An army that looked sloppy was an army that thought sloppy. An army that tolerated low standards in appearance would tolerate low standards in combat. Patton wasn't concerned with neckties for their own sake. He was concerned with building a culture of excellence. And culture started with the visible, the measurable, the enforceable. If a soldier couldn't be bothered to wear his uniform correctly, how could he be trusted to maintain his rifle correctly? If an officer couldn't enforce dress standards, how could he enforce fire discipline? Something changed in those 17 days. Units that had been scattered and demoralized began to function as cohesive teams. Soldiers started taking pride in their appearance and their equipment. Morning formations became precise. Weapons were cleaned and inspected daily. Vehicles were maintained to high standards. Radio operators practiced communications procedures. Squad leaders rehearsed small unit tactics. Platoon leaders walked the ground where they would fight, studying terrain and planning defensive positions. The casual, almost careless attitude that had characterized American forces before Kasserine Pass disappeared. Men who had retreated in disorder began to believe they could advance in order. Men who had been defeated began to believe they could win. Patton was building an army that looked professional. More importantly, he was building an army that believed it was professional. Belief mattered. An army that believes it will win fights differently than an army that expects to lose. Patton gave the Second Corps that belief through discipline, through standards, through his own absolute confidence that American soldiers, properly trained and properly led, could beat any army in the world. While Patton rebuilt morale, Eisenhower rebuilt doctrine. The problems at Kasserine Pass had been systemic. American artillery couldn't mass fires because each battery operated independently. American armor fought tank to tank instead of concentrating fire. American air support was poorly coordinated with ground operations. American commanders didn't understand combined arms warfare. These weren't problems that could be fixed with better soldiers. They required new tactics, new procedures, and new command structures. Eisenhower assembled his staff and gave them one order: fix everything, fast. The artillery reforms came first because artillery was America's strongest asset. American artillery pieces were excellent. American artillery ammunition was plentiful. American gunners were well trained. The problem was coordination. Before Kasserine Pass, each American artillery battery had its own dedicated observers on separate radio frequencies. A forward observer with the 3rd Battalion could only call fire from 3rd Battalion guns, even if 2nd Battalion artillery was closer to the target or had better firing positions. This meant American artillery could never achieve the mass fires that made German artillery so deadly. German forward observers could call fires from any battery within range, creating sudden, overwhelming concentrations of firepower on key targets. Within 1 week of Kasserine Pass, Eisenhower's staff began developing a new fire direction system that would allow coordination of artillery fires across multiple batteries. The technical challenges were significant. Different batteries used different radio frequencies. Fire direction centers used different procedures. Artillery officers had been trained to control only their own batteries. The solution required new radio equipment, new training, and most importantly, a new mindset. Artillery officers had to think of artillery as a corps-level asset, not a battalion-level asset. By early March, the new procedures were being tested in training exercises. By mid-March, when the Second Corps went back into combat, the artillery battalions were practicing coordinated fire missions. The change fundamentally improved American artillery effectiveness. The impact would be dramatic at Reorganized. The armor reforms were more complex. American tank doctrine before Kasserine Pass emphasized tank versus tank combat. Tanks were supposed to fight other tanks. This doctrine came from the cavalry tradition. American armored forces had evolved from horse cavalry, and the cavalry mindset emphasized direct engagement with enemy cavalry. American commanders sent their armor forward to engage German panzers in direct combat. This played to German strengths. German tank commanders had 3 years of combat experience across multiple theaters. They had fought in Poland in 1939, France in 1940, Russia from 1941 onward. They knew how to maneuver, how to use terrain, how to concentrate fire, how to exploit weaknesses. American tank commanders had no combat experience. They had trained in the deserts of California and the plains of Texas against other American tanks. They advanced in straight lines, exposed their flanks, and fought as individuals instead of units. At Kasserine Pass, American tanks were destroyed piecemeal, because they attacked without coordination and without support. Eisenhower's staff revised American armor doctrine based on hard lessons from Kasserine. Tanks were no longer primarily weapons for fighting other tanks. Tanks were mobile fire support for infantry. American armor would advance with infantry, use terrain for cover, and rely on artillery and tank destroyers to eliminate German tanks. Tank destroyers, not tanks, would fight German armor. This was a fundamental change in American tactical thinking. The United States Army had created tank destroyer battalions specifically for this mission, equipping them with high-velocity guns mounted on mobile platforms. But at Kasserine Pass, tank destroyer battalions had been broken up into platoons and scattered across the battlefield. Individual platoons had been overrun or bypassed. The new doctrine called for tank destroyer battalions to fight as unified battalions, concentrating their firepower at critical points. This required new training, new coordination, and new command relationships, but it played to American strengths. Americans had excellent artillery to suppress German tanks. They had good tank destroyers to kill German tanks. They didn't need to beat Germans at their own game. They needed to fight a different game entirely. The command structure reforms were the most dramatic. Before Kasserine Pass, Fredendall had split his divisions into small combat commands operating independently. This gave German forces the opportunity to defeat American units one by one. Eisenhower's new doctrine emphasized mass. Divisions would fight together, not separately. Combat commands would stay under divisional control. Mutual support would be mandatory. No unit would be positioned where it couldn't be reinforced or supported by adjacent units. These reforms happened simultaneously with Patton's discipline campaign. While Patton made soldiers wear proper uniforms, Eisenhower's staff rewrote the rulebook for modern warfare. While Patton inspected foxholes, artillery officers practiced coordination procedures. While Patton demanded salutes, tank destroyer units prepared for unified employment. The combination was deliberate. Eisenhower needed soldiers who believed they were part of a professional army, and he needed that army to actually be professional. Morale and competence had to advance together. On March 17, 1943, 11 days after Patton took command, the 1st Infantry Division and 1st Armored Division moved forward into central Tunisia. Their objective was the town of Gafsa, an oasis in the interior plains. Intelligence reported that Gafsa was lightly defended. American forces took the town with minimal opposition. On March 18th, the 1st Ranger Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel William Darby, pushed ahead and occupied the oasis town of Ielgeta. Again, almost no opposition. The Italian defenders retreated to the hills overlooking Ielgeta, blocking the mountain pass that led south to the coastal plain. The 2nd Corps was now in an excellent position. If American forces could push through the Ielgeta Pass to the coast, they would cut off German forces in southern Tunisia from their supply lines. The Germans would be trapped between American forces to the west and British forces advancing from the east. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, commanding German forces in Tunisia after Rommel's departure on March 9th, understood this immediately. He couldn't allow Americans to break through at Ielgeta. Von Arnim felt that a spoiling attack would be enough to drive the Americans back. On March 22nd, von Arnim ordered the 10th Panzer Division to attack Ielgeta and destroy American positions there. The 10th Panzer Division was one of Germany's elite armored formations. It had fought in France, Russia, and North Africa. The division's tank commanders had years of combat experience. They had destroyed hundreds of enemy tanks. They knew how to coordinate infantry, armor, and artillery. They had never lost a major engagement. The German officers planning the attack on Ielgeta expected to destroy American forces the same way they had destroyed them at Kasserine Pass. They expected American units to scatter when hit by massed armor. They expected poor coordination, weak artillery, no air support. They expected to be fighting the same American army they had defeated 4 weeks earlier. They were wrong. At 0600 hours on March 23, 1943, 50 German tanks emerged from the mountain pass into the Ielgeta Valley. The sun was just rising behind the American positions, silhouetting the German column against the western mountains. Panzerkampfwagen Mark V tanks led the advance, their long-barreled 75mm guns clearly visible. Behind them came Marder tank destroyers, open-topped vehicles mounting captured Soviet 76mm guns. Armored half-tracks carrying Panzergrenadier infantry followed in formation. German motorcycle reconnaissance units raced ahead to scout the American positions. The German column advanced at speed, engines roaring, tank treads churning up clouds of dust that hung in the still morning air. They were attacking in the open across flat ground approximately 2 miles wide. Confident that American forces would break before they reached the town, German commanders had seen Americans break at Kasserine Pass. They expected the same result here. The Americans were waiting, silent, disciplined, invisible. Major General Terry Allen had positioned the 1st Infantry Division across the valley in depth, not in a single line. This was a critical tactical change from Kasserine Pass. Forward units occupied high ground overlooking the valley, dug in with interlocking fields of fire. Behind them, infantry battalions were positioned in successive defensive lines, each capable of mutual support. Artillery was positioned behind the ridges, invisible to German observers but registered on every likely avenue of approach. American forward observers occupied concealed positions with clear views of the entire valley. Tank destroyer battalions were dug in at key positions with clear fields of fire, camouflaged so thoroughly that they were invisible from more than 100 yards. Infantry had proper foxholes, dug deep enough to protect against tank overrun. Every unit knew where adjacent units were positioned. Radio frequencies were coordinated across the entire division. Fire direction centers were established with direct communications to every artillery battery. Ammunition was stockpiled at gun positions. Medical aid stations were positioned to handle casualties. Supply routes were marked and secured. Minefields had been laid during the night at locations determined by analysis of German tactics at Kasserine Pass. This wasn't the scattered, uncoordinated defense that had failed at Kasserine Pass. This was a prepared defensive position built according to the new doctrine developed in the 4 weeks since Kasserine, incorporating every lesson learned from that defeat. The German tanks advanced across the valley floor. They moved fast, maintaining formation, confident in their superiority. At 400 yards from the American positions, the lead tanks hit the minefield. Explosions erupted beneath panzer chassis. Tanks stopped, tracks blown off, crews bailing out. The German column slowed, bunching up as tanks in the rear tried to avoid the mines. This was exactly what American artillery observers had been waiting for. The artillery strike came from batteries positioned throughout the sector. American forward observers had been tracking the German column since it entered the valley. They had calculated ranges, adjusted for wind, and coordinated with fire direction centers. When the Germans hit the minefield and bunched up, the order was given: fire for effect. Not just the batteries assigned to the 1st Infantry Division. Every battery within range. 105mm howitzers, 155mm howitzers. The concentrated fire was continuous, coordinated, devastating. The first salvo landed among the stalled German tanks with precision. High explosive rounds detonated against tank armor, disabling tracks and turrets. White phosphorus rounds burst overhead, showering burning chemicals that stuck to metal and flesh. The second salvo landed even as the first was still exploding. Then the third, then the fourth. The bombardment continued for 12 minutes without pause. German tanks that had survived the minefield were hit repeatedly by high explosive and white phosphorus rounds. Half tracks exploded, their thin armor no protection against artillery fragments. Infantry who had dismounted to clear mines were caught in the open with no cover. The few German tanks that tried to retreat found their path blocked by disabled vehicles and continuing artillery fire. The German column was trapped in the killing zone, unable to advance, unable to retreat, being systematically destroyed by American artillery firing at maximum rate. The American artillery was doing what it had failed to do at Kasserine Pass. It was delivering mass fires on a single target with timing and coordination, using procedures developed specifically to address the failures of Kasserine Pass. When the artillery lifted, American tank destroyers opened fire. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion was equipped with M3 gun motor carriages, half-tracks mounting 75mm guns. They fired from concealed positions, targeting German tanks that were trying to reorganize after the artillery barrage. The tank destroyer crews had trained for exactly this scenario. They had studied German tactics. They knew how panzers maneuvered. They knew where to aim. They fired methodically, one tank at a time, waiting for clean shots. The 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M10 tank destroyers mounting 3-inch guns, provided additional firepower from supporting positions. The German advance collapsed. 30 tanks were destroyed or disabled by 0900 hours. The 10th Panzer Division withdrew to the mountain pass, leaving burning vehicles across the valley floor. Allen watched the retreat through field glasses and made no move to pursue. His orders were to hold Elgeta, not chase Germans into the mountains. When 2 German tanks approached his headquarters during the height of the battle, Staff officers suggested withdrawal. Allen refused with words that became legendary. "I will like hell put out," he said, "and I will shoot the first bastard who does." The Americans had won their first defensive victory against German armor. But the Germans weren't finished. At 16:45 hours, the 10th Panzer Division attacked again. This time they came from a different direction, trying to flank the American positions. The result was the same. American artillery delivered mass fires on the German column. Tank destroyers engaged from prepared positions. German tanks were destroyed before they could close with American infantry. By nightfall, the 10th Panzer Division had withdrawn permanently. They joined Italian forces in the hills east of Yelgeta, but made no further attempts to break through the valley. The Battle of Yelgeta continued for 2 more weeks as American forces tried to push through the mountain passes. The fighting was difficult. Italian forces defending the high ground at hills 369 and 772 fought tenaciously. American attacks made limited progress, but the strategic situation had changed. On March 26th, British forces launched Operation Supercharge 2, breaking through the Mareth line to the east and forcing German forces to retreat north. The Axis position in southern Tunisia was collapsing. By April 7th, 1943, American forces from Yelgeta linked up with elements of the British 8th Army on the Yelgeta to Gabes Road at 1700 hours. The remaining German forces were trapped in northern Tunisia. The campaign was effectively over. The Battle of Yelgeta was the first time American forces had decisively defeated German armor in combat. The victory validated every reform Eisenhower had implemented since Kasserine Pass. The improved artillery coordination had worked effectively. Tank destroyers employed as unified battalions rather than dispersed platoons had proven their worth. Combined arms coordination had been excellent. Air support, though still imperfect, had improved significantly. Most importantly, American soldiers had proven they could stand their ground against experienced German forces. The Germans noticed, after Yelgeta, German commanders stopped calling American soldiers cowards. Intelligence reports acknowledged American tactical competence. Rommel, who had been recalled to Germany 2 weeks before Yelgeta, later documented in his papers that American forces had recovered very quickly after their first shock, and had soon succeeded in damming up German advances. The respect was grudging, but it was real. Americans could fight. What made the transformation remarkable was the speed. 27 days separated Kasserine Pass from Yelgeta. In that time, the Second Corps had replaced its commander, revised its doctrine, retrained its forces, and proven its competence in combat. No other Allied army had adapted that quickly. The British Army had taken years to develop effective combined arms tactics after early defeats in France and North Africa. Soviet forces had needed 18 months after the German invasion in June of 1941 to develop operational competence at Stalingrad. The Germans themselves had required extensive experience in Poland and France before perfecting their blitzkrieg tactics. The American army had done it in less than 4 weeks. The reasons for this rapid adaptation were systemic and interconnected. First, American forces accepted that they had a problem. There was no denial, no excuses, no blame shifting. This was remarkable given the military culture of most nations. Defeated armies typically blamed soldiers for lack of fighting spirit, blamed subordinate commanders for tactical errors, or blamed logistics for inadequate supply. They rarely blamed doctrine, and they almost never questioned fundamental assumptions about how to fight. Eisenhower and his staff conducted a brutally honest assessment of what had gone wrong at Kasserine Pass. They identified specific failures in leadership, doctrine, and coordination. They published detailed after-action reports that catalogued mistakes without euphemism. They didn't blame soldiers for breaking under German attack. They blamed themselves for putting soldiers in positions where breaking was inevitable. They didn't blame tank crews for losing to German panzers. They blamed doctrine for sending American tanks into fights they couldn't win. This allowed them to focus on fixing systems rather than punishing individuals. Officers who had commanded at Kasserine Pass were reassigned to training duties where they taught the next generation of officers what not to do. Their experience, even their failures, became institutional knowledge. Second, American forces had the authority to make changes quickly without waiting for approval from higher headquarters thousands of miles away. Eisenhower didn't need to cable Washington for permission to relieve Fredendall. He didn't need War Department approval to revise artillery doctrine or reorganize tank destroyer battalions. He had been granted theater-level authority to command as he saw fit. This was different from other Allied armies. British commanders in North Africa answered to the War Office in London, where career bureaucrats who had never heard a shot fired in anger reviewed every significant decision. British doctrine changes required committee review, formal analysis, and approval by senior officers in London who were fighting a different war. Soviet commanders answered to Stalin, who personally approved or disapproved tactical changes based on political considerations as much as military merit. German commanders answered to Hitler, who increasingly made tactical decisions from his headquarters in East Prussia based on ideology rather than battlefield reality. American commanders in the field had genuine authority to change how they fought based on what they learned. This decentralization of decision-making authority was an American military tradition dating back to the Continental Army, but it proved decisive in World War II. Third, American forces had the resources to implement changes rapidly and at scale. New equipment like M10 tank destroyers arrived within weeks of being requested, shipped across the Atlantic on fast freighters. Additional artillery batteries were formed, trained, and assigned to the Second Corps. The United States Army had activated hundreds of artillery battalions in 1942 and early 1943. When Second Corps needed more artillery support, those battalions were available. Air liaison officers were trained at newly established schools and deployed to North Africa within weeks. Radio equipment that didn't exist in January was being mass-produced in February and issued to units in March. The American industrial base provided whatever was needed to support the reforms. This wasn't propaganda or exaggeration. American factories in 1943 were producing military equipment at a rate that no other nation could match. Tanks, trucks, jeeps, artillery pieces, rifles, ammunition, uniforms, medical supplies, food, and countless other items poured out of American factories in quantities that seemed impossible to observers from other nations. Other Allied armies had to fight with whatever equipment they had. British forces in North Africa used equipment that had been designed in the 1930s and produced in limited quantities by factories that were targets for German bombing. Soviet forces used equipment that was excellent in some categories, but chronically short in others because Soviet industry had been devastated by the German invasion. German forces by 1943 were beginning to experience shortages of everything from fuel to ammunition to replacement vehicles, because Allied bombing and resource depletion was strangling German industry. Americans could request new equipment, new vehicles, new weapons, and receive them quickly. If something didn't work, it could be replaced. If something needed to be modified, modifications could be implemented across the force. This abundance of material resources enabled rapid experimentation and rapid deployment of solutions. An army that must fight with inadequate equipment cannot afford to experiment. An army with abundant equipment can afford to try new approaches, discard what doesn't work, and scale up what does work. Fourth, American forces were willing to learn from their enemies. Staff officers studied German tactics. They analyzed how Germans coordinated armor, infantry, and artillery. They identified German weaknesses as well as strengths. They adapted German techniques that worked and developed counters to German techniques that were effective against Americans. There was no pride, no insistence on doing things the American way. If the Germans did something better, Americans studied it and adapted. Fifth, American forces emphasized training and practice. Patton's 17-day transformation of the Second Corps focused heavily on basic skills and unit cohesion. Soldiers practiced digging proper foxholes. Tank crews practiced coordinating with infantry. Artillery batteries practiced fire coordination. Tank destroyer battalions trained as unified forces rather than dispersed elements. Air liaison officers practiced calling air strikes. The training was repetitive, intensive, and focused on the specific problems identified at Kasserine Pass. By the time American forces went back into combat, they had practiced the new approaches until they became automatic. These 5 factors created an institutional culture that valued adaptation over tradition. American forces weren't bound by decades of military tradition. They had no institutional investment in proving that old methods worked. They could change quickly because they had nothing to defend. This was a paradox. American inexperience, which had been a liability at Kasserine Pass, became an advantage when it came to adaptation. Inexperienced forces could learn faster because they had less to unlearn. The British assessment after Kasserine Pass was based on decades of military experience fighting the Germans. British forces had been fighting since September of 1939. They had been defeated in France, defeated in Greece, defeated in Crete, and pushed back across North Africa before finally achieving victory at El Alamein. The British learning curve had taken 3 full years. They assumed the Americans would need the same amount of time if Americans could learn at all. It was difficult to understand why the British found it so hard to comprehend that the Americans taking several months to learn what it had taken the British Army 3 years to learn was actually a good sign for the Allied cause, not a bad one. The American learning curve was steeper and faster precisely because Americans were willing to admit failure and change course. British military culture emphasized tradition, precedent, and established procedure. Changes had to be approved through formal channels, documented in regulations, and tested extensively before implementation. American military culture, particularly under Eisenhower's leadership, emphasized results over process. If something didn't work, change it immediately. Test it in combat, not in training. Refine it based on battlefield results. This pragmatic approach, born of necessity and enabled by American resources, created a learning cycle measured in weeks rather than years. The lessons of Kasserine Pass and El Geta spread through the entire American army. The improved artillery coordination procedures became standard across all American units in all theaters. The emphasis on combined arms warfare was incorporated into training at Fort Benning and other stateside bases. Tank destroyer doctrine was refined to emphasize battalion-level employment rather than dispersed platoon operations. Air-ground coordination procedures were developed and tested. By the time American forces invaded Sicily on July 10, 1943, the improvements were already visible. American forces fought more effectively, coordinated better, and adapted faster to changing battlefield conditions. The invasion of Italy in September of 1943 showed further improvement. American commanders were more aggressive. Coordination between units was smoother. Artillery support was devastating. Air support was better integrated. German forces in Italy fought defensive battles with great skill, but they couldn't stop the American advance. The Americans who landed at Salerno on September 9th were not the same Americans who had retreated at Kasserine Pass. They were a professional, competent, combat-effective force. By June of 1944, when American forces landed at Normandy, the transformation was complete. The American army that stormed the beaches of France was one of the most effective fighting forces in the world. They had superior artillery coordination, excellent air support, good combined arms integration, and experienced leadership. They still made mistakes. The fighting in Normandy was difficult. German forces defended tenaciously, but American forces adapted to each new challenge. When they encountered hedgerows, they developed hedgerow cutters. When they faced German armor, they called in air support and tank destroyers. When German defenses proved too strong, they massed artillery and blasted through. The culture of adaptation that had been forged in Tunisia became the defining characteristic of American forces in Europe. The contrast with other Allied armies was stark. British forces in Normandy used many of the same tactics they had used in North Africa. Soviet forces used the same mass assault tactics they had developed at Stalingrad. German forces tried to fight the same war they had fought in France in 1940. American forces kept evolving. They identified problems, developed solutions, implemented changes, and moved on to the next problem. This wasn't because American soldiers were inherently better than British, Soviet, or German soldiers. It was because the American military system encouraged and rewarded adaptation. The speed of American adaptation had strategic consequences. By adapting faster than their enemies, American forces forced German commanders to constantly adjust their own tactics. German forces that developed effective counters to American tactics found that Americans had already moved on to new methods. This created a tactical tempo that German forces couldn't match. Germans were always reacting to American innovations rather than implementing their own. This tactical initiative, the ability to force the enemy to adapt to you rather than adapting to them, was a direct result of the lessons learned in Tunisia. The long-term impact of the Kasserine to El Geta transformation extended beyond World War II. The American military incorporated rapid adaptation into its institutional culture. After-action reviews became mandatory. Units were expected to identify problems and develop solutions. Commanders who couldn't adapt were relieved. The emphasis on learning from combat experience became a defining characteristic of the American military. This was directly traceable to the lessons of February and March of 1943. Other militaries studied the American experience, but struggled to replicate it. The British military maintained its emphasis on tradition and established procedure. Soviet military doctrine emphasized centralized control and standardized tactics. German military culture valued aggressive initiative, but struggled with institutional learning at the operational level. The American combination of decentralized authority, institutional flexibility, and systematic analysis remained unique. It wasn't that other militaries couldn't adapt. It was that they couldn't adapt as quickly. The transformation from Kasserine Pass to Yelgeta remains the fastest large-scale military adaptation in modern warfare. 27 days from humiliating defeat to decisive victory. Less than 4 weeks from tactical incompetence to operational effectiveness. The speed was unprecedented. The thoroughness was remarkable. The lasting impact was profound. American forces in World War II became the standard for military adaptation because they proved that armies could change quickly when they accepted failure, granted authority to field commanders, provided necessary resources, learned from enemies, and emphasized training. The men who fought at Yelgeta didn't know they were part of a historic transformation. They knew they had been beaten at Kasserine Pass. They knew they needed to prove themselves. They knew Patton was demanding and Eisenhower was watching. They knew the Germans considered them inferior. They knew the British doubted their competence. They fought at Yelgeta to prove everyone wrong. They fought to show that Americans could stand against experienced German forces. They fought because their commanders asked them to fight. The fact that they were participating in the fastest military transformation in history wasn't something they considered. They were focused on surviving the next German attack. But survive they did. The 1st Infantry Division stopped the 10th Panzer Division cold. American artillery crushed German armor. American tank destroyers proved their worth when employed as unified battalions. American infantry held their ground. The transformation was complete. The American army that had been rooted at Kasserine Pass had become an army that could defeat experienced German forces in open combat. The journey from failure to success took 27 days. The lessons learned during those 27 days shaped American military doctrine for generations. Major General Terry Allen stood in his command post on the evening of March 23, 1943, and watched the last German tanks withdraw from Yelgeta Valley. His division had won. American forces had won. The Germans, who had mocked American soldiers 4 weeks earlier, were retreating. The British, who had questioned American competence, would have to reassess. The Italian forces, who had expected an easy victory, were dug into defensive positions in the hills, no longer attacking. Allen didn't celebrate. There was more fighting ahead. The campaign in Tunisia would continue for 6 more weeks until the final Axis surrender on May 13th. But something fundamental had changed. American forces had proven they could adapt faster than any other army in the war. They had taken the worst defeat of the war and turned it into a template for victory. That was the real triumph of Yelgeta. Not the tactical victory over the 10th Panzer Division, but the institutional victory over failure itself. The ability to look defeat in the face, accept responsibility, identify what went wrong, fix it immediately, and come back stronger. That's what separated the American military transformation from every other Allied force in World War II. The British took 3 years to learn what Americans learned in 27 days. The Soviets needed 18 months. The Germans, for all their tactical brilliance, never truly adapted their strategic approach. But the Americans, 27 days, from worst defeat to first victory, from questioned competence to proven capability, from scattered units fighting alone to coordinated divisions fighting together. If you found this story as compelling as I did researching it, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps get these forgotten stories to more people. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? We're pulling stories like this out of the archives every single week. Real history, real transformations, real lessons that still matter today. The transformation from Kasserine Pass to Yelgeta proves something that military historians have debated for decades. Success in warfare isn't just about having the best equipment or the most experienced soldiers. It's about having a system that can learn faster than the enemy. It's about leadership that accepts failure and demands excellence. It's about institutional flexibility that allows rapid change. It's about resources that can be mobilized quickly when needed. And it's about soldiers who believe they can win. The American Army of 1943 had all of those things, not because Americans were inherently superior, not because of some mythical American exceptionalism, but because the system was designed to learn, designed to adapt, designed to improve. Eisenhower created that system in the crucible of North Africa. Patton enforced that system with iron discipline. Allen and his soldiers proved that system worked at El Geta. And that system, refined and improved over decades, became the foundation of American military doctrine for the next 80 years. When you look at American military operations in Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, you see the same pattern. Initial setbacks followed by rapid adaptation, problems identified, solutions developed, changes implemented, improvements measured, the after-action review, the lessons learned process, the emphasis on tactical flexibility, the delegation of authority to field commanders, the willingness to question doctrine. All of it traces back to those 27 days in Tunisia. The soldiers at El Geta didn't just win a battle, they validated a system. They proved that American forces could adapt faster than any other army in the world, and that ability to adapt, more than any weapon or technology, became America's decisive advantage in World War II and beyond. That's the real lesson of Kasserine Pass and El Geta. Not that Americans were unbeatable. They clearly weren't. They got beaten badly at Kasserine. But they were unmatched in their ability to learn from defeat, to change course, to try new approaches, to experiment, to fail fast and succeed faster. 27 days. That's all it took to transform defeat into victory, to turn a routed army into a conquering force, to prove that adaptation matters more than experience. The Germans had more experience. The British had more tradition. The Soviets had more mass. But the Americans had something more valuable than any of those things. They had the ability to change. And in warfare, as in life, the ability to change is the ability to survive. The 10th Panzer Division learned that lesson the hard way at El Geta. So did every other Axis force that faced American troops for the rest of the war. The Americans they fought at Kasserine Pass were gone, replaced by an army that had learned from failure. An army that had adapted faster than any force in modern military history. An army that would help win World War II. Thanks for watching. If you want more stories like this, more forgotten battles and transformations that changed history, check out the video YouTube's recommending next. You won't regret it. And seriously, drop that comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if this story connected with you. Tell me if someone in your family served in World War II. I read every single comment. See you in the next one.